Robert Harrison woke before dawn, the way he always did lately, with a dull pressure behind his eyes and a tightness in his chest that refused to loosen. The doctors had given it a name he chose not to repeat, a condition that came with charts, warnings, and careful voices. To Robert, it felt simpler and crueler than any diagnosis. Time had begun to slip out from under him. He moved slowly through the mansion, the old floors creaking beneath his feet, one hand trailing along the wall, as if the house itself were the only thing steady enough to keep him upright. This place had been built with his hands and his money, brick by brick, decision by decision. Every hallway carried a memory: late nights, arguments, celebrations, silence. Lately, though, the house felt different, quieter in a way that wasn't peaceful, watchful. Robert told himself it was just age, just the way illness sharpened the mind into imagining threats that weren't there. He straightened his shoulders and headed toward the study, intending to pour himself a cup of coffee before the day began. He slowed when he heard voices. Daniel's voice came first, low and tired, followed by Emily's soft, controlled, intimate, in a way that didn't belong to the early morning. The study door was ajar, a thin line of light spilling into the hallway. Robert hadn't meant to listen. He paused only because his breath caught, because something in Emily's tone made his skin prickle. Then she said it. "Once he's gone," Emily whispered, her voice barely more than air, "the house is ours." The words landed like a blow to Robert's chest, not sharp, crushing. His heart slammed against his ribs, each beat loud enough that he was sure they could hear it through the door. He stood frozen in the hallway, one hand gripping the edge of a framed photograph, his reflection staring back at him, older, paler, suddenly fragile in a way he'd never allowed himself to be. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. Inside the study, Emily continued, as if she hadn't just shattered something fundamental. She spoke calmly, methodically, outlining thoughts that sounded rehearsed. The house, the accounts, the way things would need to be handled once Robert was no longer able to manage them himself. She spoke of efficiency, of timing, of making sure everything transitioned smoothly. Daniel murmured in response, uncertain, his voice strained, but he didn't stop her. Robert's mind struggled to keep pace. Gone. The house is ours. She wasn't talking about someday in the abstract. She was talking about him, his absence, his death, his removal from the life he still believed was his to live. The coldness in her voice stunned him most. There was no hesitation, no remorse, just calculation. He felt the urge to push the door open, to step inside and demand an explanation, to look his son in the eye and ask him what, exactly, he was allowing. His fingers twitched at his side, but doubt crept in just as fast. Had he misheard? Was this his illness playing tricks on him, turning harmless conversation into betrayal? Daniel hadn't explicitly agreed. Emily hadn't used his name. Reason whispered that confronting them now would make him look weak, paranoid, everything he feared becoming. So Robert did the only thing he could do in that moment. He stepped back, silently, carefully. He retreated down the hallway, every step feeling like a lie he was telling himself. His thoughts raced, colliding with memories of Emily's smiles, her concern for his health, the way she'd taken charge of small decisions lately, without asking. Had it all been preparation? Had he been watching his own power slip away without realizing it? He reached the end of the hall and leaned against the wall, forcing his breathing to slow. Betrayal sat heavy in his chest, mixed with confusion and something darker: fear, not of dying, but of being erased before he was gone, of becoming an obstacle in his own home. As the voices in the study faded into muffled sound, Robert stared at the closed front door of the mansion and understood, with a clarity that chilled him, that whatever was happening under his roof was only beginning. And if Emily was already speaking about a future without him, then he had far less time and far fewer allies than he'd ever imagined. The house changed after that morning, though nothing visible shifted. No doors slammed, no arguments erupted, yet every room seemed tighter, the air heavier, as if the mansion itself had begun holding its breath. Robert moved through his days quietly, watching instead of speaking, listening instead of leading. Once, he had commanded attention without effort. Now, he felt like a guest in a place that had been shaped by his name. Emily was the first difference he noticed. She no longer asked how he slept, no longer paused to include him in conversations at breakfast. When Robert attempted small-talk comments about the weather, a news headline, a memory she answered without looking up, her tone clipped, polite in a way that felt dismissive rather than respectful. The warmth she once performed so effortlessly had cooled into something transactional. It wasn't hostility. It was worse. Indifference. Daniel changed, too, though in a quieter way. He seemed constantly elsewhere, phone always in hand, eyes drifting away when Robert spoke. Conversations that once carried weight now dissolved into half-answers and vague nods. Robert tried to tell himself it was work, stress, marriage. But the distance felt deliberate, as if Daniel had already begun preparing himself for a future where his father's voice mattered less. The silence gnawed at Robert. It pressed against his chest at night, sharper than his illness ever had. Finally, he called Martin. They met in Martin's office, a familiar place filled with dark wood and old books. The scent of paper and leather grounding Robert more than any medication could. He chose his words carefully, hinting rather than accusing, explaining his unease, the shifts he couldn't explain. Martin listened, hands folded, expression unreadable. When Robert finished, the lawyer exhaled slowly. "I need facts," Martin said at last. "Not feelings, not impressions. If I step in without proof, it creates waves you may not be able to control." Robert nodded, though frustration burned beneath his calm. He had built his life on instincts sharpened by experience. Now, those instincts were being treated as weakness. Martin wasn't wrong, but that didn't make the doubt any easier to swallow. Robert left the office knowing one thing clearly. If something was happening behind his back, he would have to see it himself. The day Rebecca returned, the house seemed to stir. She arrived without announcement, her car crunching up the gravel drive just before dusk. Robert watched from the front window as she stepped out, older, sharper around the eyes, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who had learned how to survive on her own terms. It had been years since she'd lived under this roof, years marked by distance and disagreements neither of them had known how to mend. From the moment she walked inside, Rebecca sensed it. The tension, the way conversations stalled when she entered a room, the way Emily's smile tightened just slightly, calculating. Rebecca hugged her father longer than necessary, murmuring that something felt off. Robert said nothing. He didn't trust himself to. That night at dinner, Robert tried again with Daniel. He asked about work, about plans, about things fathers and sons talked about when they were trying not to talk about what mattered. Daniel's responses were polite but hollow, his attention drifting toward Emily, who spoke for him more often than not. She corrected details, redirected topics, subtly positioned herself as the authority in decisions that had once been Robert's alone. Robert noticed the pattern. Emily would raise concerns about investments, about liquidity, about future planning, always framing her suggestions as responsible, practical. Daniel listened. More than listened, he deferred. When Robert pushed back gently, Emily smiled and said things like, "We just want to make sure everything's secure," as if Robert hadn't spent decades doing exactly that. Rebecca watched too. Over coffee the next morning, she pulled Robert aside, her voice low. She asked questions that cut closer to the truth than Robert was ready to answer. Had Emily always been this controlling? Had Daniel always been this distant? Robert deflected, but Rebecca's eyes stayed sharp. She had always been good at reading between silences. Later, Rebecca cornered Daniel in the hallway, challenging him lightly at first, then more directly. She noticed how he stiffened when Emily entered the room, how his tone changed, how quickly he backed down. Rebecca didn't say anything yet, but suspicion took root. She'd left this house once because it felt wrong. Now, it felt dangerous. That night, Robert lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction, every subtle shift. No accusations had been made, no battles declared, but he understood now that a war had already begun quiet, strategic, unfolding in glances and paperwork and silence. And if he waited too long to act, he feared he might lose more than just control. He might lose his son. Emily suggested dinner as if it were an afterthought, her tone light, almost caring. She mentioned Robert's health, asked whether he'd been eating properly, even offered to cook herself instead of having staff handle it. On the surface, it was everything a considerate daughter-in-law should be. Yet Robert felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not pain this time, but instinct, the kind that had saved him from bad deals and worse partners long before his body began to fail him. That evening, the dining room glowed with warm light. candles reflecting off polished wood. Emily moved gracefully between the table and the kitchen, attentive, smiling, playing her role flawlessly. Daniel sat across from Robert, distracted, nodding absently as he scrolled through messages on his phone. If there was tension in the room, Daniel didn't seem to notice, or chose not to. Robert watched Emily closely, the way her eyes lingered just a second too long when finances were mentioned. The way she subtly redirected conversation whenever he spoke about the past, about decisions he'd made. She laughed easily, touched Daniel's arm affectionately, projecting stability and devotion. It was convincing, almost impressive. Halfway through the meal, Robert decided to press. "I've been thinking about the future," he said casually, setting down his fork. "About how things will be handled when I'm not as hands-on." Emily didn't hesitate. She smiled, serene, reassuring. "Of course. We've talked about making sure everything's taken care of long-term. You deserve peace, Robert." "Taken care of how?" he asked, his voice steady. She spoke in generalities, trusts, advisors, careful planning. Nothing concrete. Nothing he could grab onto. Every answer felt designed to soothe rather than inform. Daniel finally looked up, adding a vague comment about modernizing things, streamlining operations. Robert nodded, but inside, something hardened. This wasn't conversation. It was performance. Later that night, Rebecca found him in the library. She closed the door behind her, her expression serious. "She's not who she pretends to be," Rebecca said quietly, wasting no time. "I don't know exactly what she's doing yet, but I can feel it. She's controlling the flow of information, decisions, even Daniel." Robert leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. Part of him wanted to defend Emily, if only to deny what he already suspected. But the words caught in his throat. Rebecca had always been perceptive, too perceptive, sometimes. This time, her concern mirrored his own too closely to ignore. "I'm watching," Robert said finally. "That's all." Rebecca studied him, unconvinced. "Be careful," she replied. "She's already playing a longer game than you think." The next morning, Robert went somewhere he hadn't needed to visit in years, his private office, tucked away behind a locked door few people ever entered. He pulled files, account statements, investment summaries. At first glance, everything looked normal, clean, organized. But the deeper he looked, the more the numbers began to misalign. Transfers he didn't recall authorizing. Small amounts moved frequently, just enough to avoid attention. Accounts that had been rerouted. Oversight quietly shifted. It wasn't theft. Not yet. It was positioning. As the days passed, Emily seemed to sense the shift in him. She grew warmer, more attentive, often stepping in between Robert and Rebecca under the guise of concern. She suggested Rebecca rest, travel, take time for herself. She offered to handle errands, calls, paperwork, anything that kept Robert dependent, isolated. When Rebecca tried to raise concerns again, Emily laughed them off, framing her as dramatic, overly suspicious. Robert said little. He watched. He read. He remembered. Late one night, alone in his office, Robert spread documents across the desk, the weight of them pressing down on him. The pattern was clear now. This wasn't about comfort or care. It was about control, about ensuring that when the time came, whether by illness or force, everything would already be in Emily's hands. Robert closed the folder slowly, his reflection staring back at him from the darkened window. He had underestimated her. Worse, he had given her time. And as the realization settled in, one thought eclipsed all others. Whatever Emily was planning, it was far bigger and far closer than he had ever imagined. The truth didn't announce itself all at once. It emerged slowly, line by line, buried inside spreadsheets and legal summaries Robert hadn't reviewed in years. Late at night, alone in his private office, he traced transactions with a steady finger, forcing his tired eyes to stay sharp. Shell accounts, secondary holdings, assets quietly redirected through entities he didn't recognize, but when he followed the trail far enough, every path led back to Emily. The sums weren't outrageous. That was the brilliance of it. Small movements, timed carefully, hidden behind legitimate-looking paperwork, but together, they formed a pattern that made Robert's stomach turn. This wasn't poor management. It was deliberate siphoning, executed patiently, confidently, by someone who believed they wouldn't be challenged. For the first time, anger burned hotter than fear. The next morning, Robert confronted Daniel in the study, the same room where everything had begun. He laid the documents on the desk between them, his voice controlled, each word chosen with care. He didn't accuse. He asked. He pointed out inconsistencies, asked Daniel if he recognized the accounts, if he remembered authorizing certain transfers. Daniel barely glanced at the papers. "You're reading too much into this," he said, rubbing his temples. "You've been stressed." The doctors said, "Don't," Robert interrupted quietly. "Don't turn this into that." But Daniel had already decided. He dismissed the concerns as paranoia, as confusion amplified by Robert's health. He spoke gently, almost kindly, as if humoring a man past his prime. Each word landed harder than an outright denial. Robert watched his son retreat behind a wall of excuses and felt something fracture deep in his chest. Emily arrived at precisely the wrong or right moment. She took one look at the papers, then at Daniel's expression, and her face softened into concern. Not outrage, not confusion. Concern. She sat beside Daniel, placing a hand over his, speaking in a calm, measured tone about stress, about how difficult transitions could be. She never denied the accounts outright. She reframed them. Investment strategy. Safeguards. Long-term planning Robert might have forgotten approving. Later, when Robert wasn't in the room, she pushed further. She told Daniel she was worried, that Robert was struggling more than he let on, that the pressure of managing everything was becoming too much for him. She spoke about protecting the estate, protecting Daniel himself. By the time she finished, doubt had replaced loyalty in Daniel's eyes. Rebecca saw the aftermath immediately. She found Robert sitting alone, staring at nothing, the documents untouched beside him. She offered to help, insisted, even saying she could dig, connect dots, bring in outside scrutiny if needed. Robert shook his head. Not yet. Dragging her into this would make things messier, more dangerous. He still believed, foolishly perhaps, that he could contain the damage himself. That same afternoon, his phone rang. Detective Sarah Hayes introduced herself professionally, her voice steady, direct. She said she was following up on a financial matter connected to one of Robert's past business entities. Unrelated, she assured him. Routine. Still, her timing unsettled him. She asked questions that suggested a broader awareness about asset structures, oversight, recent changes. When the call ended, Robert sat very still, wondering how many eyes were already on his family. Emily, meanwhile, moved faster. She began consolidating access, persuading Daniel to sign off on additional responsibilities to lighten Robert's load. She framed every move as compassion, every signature as necessity. Daniel complied, eager to prove himself, eager to believe he was doing the right thing. With each document signed, Emily's reach extended further into the foundation Robert had built. From the sidelines, Robert watched control slip through his fingers. He saw it in how staff deferred to Emily now, in how meetings happened without him, in how Daniel stopped asking and started informing. Trust once absolute crumbled into something brittle and uncertain. The house no longer felt like a place of inheritance. It felt like contested ground. One evening, as Robert stood alone in the hallway, listening to muffled voices behind closed doors, the realization settled fully and finally. Emily wasn't preparing for a future without him. She was already living in it. And if he didn't act soon, he feared the next thing she took wouldn't be money or authority, but his remaining place in his own family. Robert found the clause by accident. He had asked for a full copy of his will, something he hadn't reviewed in detail since his health began to decline. The document arrived thick and formal, stamped and bound, the weight of it resting heavily in his hands. He sat alone in his office, reading slowly, methodically, until one paragraph stopped him cold. In the event of death or incapacitation, full executive control of the Harrison estate shall transfer to Emily Harrison. Robert read it again, and again. The words didn't change. His mouth went dry, as a hollow ache spread through his chest. He had never agreed to this, never discussed it. The clause wasn't ambiguous. It wasn't symbolic. It handed Emily absolute authority, assets, property, decisions, everything he had spent his life building. The room felt suddenly too small, the walls closing in as grief gave way to something darker. He called Martin immediately. When they met, Robert placed the document on the desk between them, his finger resting on the clause. Martin's face tightened, just briefly, before professionalism returned. He didn't deny it. He admitted, carefully, that there had been pressure. Conversations. Concerns raised about Robert's health, about continuity, about preventing chaos. Emily had framed it as a protective measure, something Robert would eventually appreciate. "I should have come to you directly," Martin said quietly, "but she made it sound urgent. I believed I was acting in your best interest." Robert leaned back, exhaustion washing over him. Trust had been breached on multiple fronts, and the realization hurt more than the clause itself. The betrayal wasn't just legal, it was personal. Armed with the truth, Robert confronted Daniel that evening. This time, he didn't soften his words. He showed Daniel the clause, explained exactly what it meant. He asked him plainly how long he'd known. Daniel faltered, deflected, then finally admitted that Emily had mentioned it in passing, framed it as precaution, temporary, necessary. Robert's anger surged. "You let her do this," he said, his voice low but shaking. "You stood by while she positioned herself over everything I own." Daniel bristled, accused Robert of overreacting, of letting fear drive him. The argument escalated quickly, years of unspoken resentment bubbling to the surface. Robert realized, with a bitter clarity, that Daniel hadn't just been manipulated. He had chosen the easier path, silence over confrontation, comfort over loyalty. Emily entered near the end, eyes wide as if walking into chaos she couldn't understand. She listened as Robert laid out the evidence, her face slowly shifting into disbelief, then hurt. She denied any malicious intent, insisted she had been misunderstood. She spoke of love, of responsibility, of wanting to protect the family when Robert could no longer do so himself. Her performance was flawless. Daniel wavered again, torn between the man who raised him and the woman who shared his bed. Rebecca didn't. She stood beside her father, unwavering. She saw through the act, through the carefully chosen words, and practiced concern. Later that night, she told Robert she was done waiting. She would help him fight legally, publicly, if necessary. Consequences be damned. Watching him suffer in silence was no longer an option. For the first time in days, Robert felt something close to relief. They began planning immediately quietly, reviewing options, identifying leverage. But as his resolve hardened, his body faltered. The stress took its toll. His hands shook more often. His chest tightened unpredictably. The warning signs he'd ignored for months grew harder to dismiss. Time, he realized, was no longer on his side. Emily noticed the shift. She sensed it in Robert's gaze, in the way he stopped explaining himself. The man she had underestimated was no longer confused or hesitant. He was focused, calculating, and that frightened her. She began making frantic calls, tightening her hold on Daniel, pushing for more control, more assurances. Too late. As Robert sat alone that night, the mansion quiet around him, he understood the truth with painful certainty. Emily hadn't just planned for his absence, she had engineered it. And now that he saw the full shape of her betrayal, one thing was clear. If she thought he would go quietly, she had made her greatest mistake. The shift was no longer subtle. Emily began rearranging the house as if Robert were already fading from it. His routines were questioned, his decisions quietly overridden. She suggested caregivers he hadn't asked for, medical evaluations he didn't need, meetings scheduled without his input, always framed as concern, always delivered with a softness that made resistance look unreasonable. To anyone watching from the outside, she was the devoted daughter-in-law preparing for the inevitable. To Robert, it felt like being erased while still breathing. Daniel absorbed it all. He stopped checking in, stopped asking his father's opinion. When Robert spoke, Daniel listened with a tight patience, as though humoring someone who had already lost relevance. Emily fed that narrative carefully, pointing out missed details, minor lapses, moments of fatigue. She never said Robert was incapable outright. She didn't have to. She let Daniel reach that conclusion himself. Robert felt the distance acutely. Every unanswered call, every shortened conversation reinforced the same message. He was becoming a liability in his own home. Rebecca refused to let him face it alone. They met in quiet corners of the house, late at night or early morning, comparing notes, documents, timelines. Rebecca used her distance from the family to her advantage, making inquiries Robert could no longer safely make himself. Together, They pieced together records, financial transfers, shell entities, signatures that didn't belong where they appeared. The evidence grew slowly, carefully. One wrong move could alert Emily, and neither of them doubted she was capable of destroying what they uncovered. Meanwhile, Emily played the long game. She began speaking openly about Robert's health to others, doctors, advisors, even staff, planting seeds of concern. She asked questions about mental fitness evaluations, about legal thresholds for incapacity. Each conversation was framed as precaution, as love. But Robert recognized the strategy. She wasn't preparing to help him. She was preparing to replace him. The breaking point came quietly. Daniel stopped speaking to Rebecca altogether. When she confronted him, he accused her of stirring conflict, of undermining his marriage. He told her she didn't understand what it was like to live with Robert day after day, watching him struggle. Rebecca stared at her brother, stunned by how completely Emily's words had become his own. That night, Daniel made his choice. He stood beside his wife and turned his back on his sister. The family fractured in a way that felt permanent. Robert watched it happen with a numb clarity. He saw the cost of silence, of giving Emily room to maneuver. He felt more alone than he ever had, not because of his illness, but because the people he trusted most had either turned away or been turned against him. The question that haunted him wasn't whether he could win. It was how much he was willing to lose in the process. The confrontation came days later. Daniel found Robert in the study, standing near the window, looking out over the property that had once symbolized everything he'd achieved. Daniel didn't sit. He spoke quickly, defensively, as if rehearsed. He said the estate needed new leadership, that Robert's methods were outdated, that clinging to control was only making things harder for everyone. "You should step aside," Daniel said. "Let things run smoothly for once." The words cut deeper than any accusation Emily had ever made. Robert turned slowly, meeting his son's eyes. He saw certainty there, not confidence, but surrender. Daniel had accepted a version of reality where his father was already a relic. Robert felt anger surge, sharp and unexpected, followed by grief so heavy it nearly buckled his knees. "I built this," Robert said quietly. "Not just the house, the life you're standing in." Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence said enough. As Daniel walked away, Robert remained where he was, staring at the dark glass of the window, his reflection faint but unbroken. The battle lines had been drawn clearly now, family on one side, legacy on the other. And as the house settled into uneasy quiet, Robert understood something with terrifying certainty. The next move would decide everything. Robert chose the timing carefully. He asked Daniel to meet him in the study late in the afternoon, when the house was quiet and the weight of the day had settled in. When Daniel arrived, guarded and impatient, Robert didn't waste time on pleasantries. He placed a thick folder on the desk and slid it forward. Inside were copies of everything: bank transfers, shell accounts, altered authorizations, timelines Rebecca had helped assemble with painstaking care. "This is what you've been defending," Robert said. Daniel flipped through the pages slowly at first, then faster. His jaw tightened. He stopped more than once, rereading figures, dates, signatures he recognized or thought he did. Robert explained calmly, laying out the scope of Emily's manipulations, how documents had been rerouted, how control had shifted without consent. He spoke not as an angry father, but as a man presenting facts that could no longer be ignored. Emily arrived mid-conversation. She froze when she saw the folder open, the evidence exposed. For a split second, panic flickered across her face before she smoothed it away. She stepped in close to Daniel, her voice trembling as she asked why he was being shown lies. She insisted the accounts were misunderstandings, the documents misinterpreted. She spoke of stress, of fear, of trying to protect everyone from Robert's decline. But something had changed. Daniel didn't immediately agree. He didn't shut Robert down. Doubt crept into his expression, subtle but unmistakable. Emily sensed it and leaned harder into her performance, tears forming, accusing Robert of cruelty, of trying to turn his son against his own wife. The words still landed, but not with the certainty they once had. Rebecca joined them moments later. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She simply asked Daniel to look again, to trust what was in front of him instead of what he'd been told. She reminded him of moments Emily had isolated him, redirected decisions, spoken for him. Daniel stood caught between them, loyalty pulling in opposite directions. His silence louder than any argument. Robert's strength faltered as the confrontation dragged on. His chest tightened, his breathing growing shallow. He leaned against the desk, steadying himself, aware that time both in this room and in his life was slipping faster now. That awareness sharpened his resolve. Hesitation was no longer an option. That night, Robert made his decision. He contacted Martin and authorized the legal challenge he had been postponing. Formal, aggressive, irreversible. Motions were drafted. Safeguards activated. Emily's claim on the estate would be contested openly, no matter the fallout. Robert knew what it would cost him: relationships, peace, perhaps even his health. But the alternative was surrender. Emily felt the ground shift beneath her. She cornered Daniel privately, her tone no longer gentle. She warned him of consequences, of scandal, of losing everything they'd built together. She suggested his father was unstable, dangerous even. When that didn't work, she threatened to leave, to take what she could while she still had the chance. Desperation bled through the cracks of her composure. Daniel said nothing. The next morning, Robert summoned everyone to the study. Emily arrived tense, defensive. Daniel followed, conflicted. Rebecca stood beside her father, silent but resolute. Robert waited until they were all seated before he spoke. His voice was weaker than it once had been, but it carried weight earned, undeniable. "I'm done pretending," he said. "This ends now." He laid out everything chronologically, meticulously. He explained the legal steps already in motion, the evidence preserved, the consequences that would follow. He didn't plead. He didn't threaten. He stated facts, the way he always had when decisions mattered. Emily interrupted, accusing him of cruelty, of betrayal. Robert didn't respond. He simply looked at Daniel. "This is your moment," Robert said, "to decide who you are." The room fell silent. The battle had reached its peak, not in raised voices or violence, but in truth finally spoken aloud. Robert felt the weight of it pressed down on him, heavy and final. This was his last stand. Whatever happened next would shape the rest of his life and his legacy. As Emily's gaze hardened and Daniel struggled to speak, Robert understood one thing clearly: there would be no turning back after this. Emily stopped pretending the moment she realized fear was no longer enough. She hired a private investigator quietly, through a third party, careful to leave no direct trail. The man's task was simple: dig into Robert Harrison's medical history, speak to doctors, nurses, anyone who might hint at cognitive decline. Emily didn't need certainty. She needed doubt, a suggestion, enough to raise questions in the right legal circles. In her mind, if Robert could be declared unfit, the battle would end without a courtroom. Robert sensed the shift before he could prove it. Calls went unanswered. Appointments were rescheduled. Conversations with staff felt filtered, cautious. Someone was asking questions he hadn't authorized. When Martin confirmed that inquiries had been made regarding medical evaluations, Robert felt the last illusion of restraint shatter. This was no longer about control of the estate. It was about erasing him as a decision-maker entirely. He moved fast. Robert met with Martin behind closed doors, his voice firm despite the strain in his chest. They discussed contingencies, legal protections, emergency filings that would preserve authority if Emily made her move first. Martin urged caution, but Robert insisted on urgency. Every hour mattered now. The law, Robert knew, favored whoever acted decisively. Daniel, meanwhile, drifted further away. Emily fed him carefully chosen fragments, stories of missed appointments, moments of confusion, exaggerated into warning signs. She spoke softly about worry, about burden, about how painful it was to watch someone decline. Daniel listened, conflicted but exhausted. The doubt she planted took root. He began to see his father through her lens, every pause and sigh interpreted as evidence. Rebecca tried to stop it. She confronted Daniel in the kitchen, her voice breaking as she pleaded with him to wake up. She reminded him of who their father had always been: sharp, deliberate, unyielding. She pointed to the timing of Emily's concern, how it surfaced only when control was threatened. But Daniel pulled away, accusing Rebecca of refusing to accept reality. He chose denial over conflict, silence over clarity. Emily pressed harder. She whispered to Daniel that he wasn't ready to lead, that without her guidance he would be sidelined entirely. She made him feel small, dependent, grateful. She positioned herself as his shield and his strategist. the only one who truly believed in him. By the time she finished, Daniel wasn't just defending her, he was doubting himself. Robert watched the walls close in. Knowing he could no longer rely on family, he reached outward. Old friends, former partners, men and women who had built empires alongside him and understood the cost of betrayal. He spoke carefully, revealing just enough to gain support without exposing his hand. Quiet alliances formed, resources offered. If Emily wanted to drag this into the open, Robert would not stand alone. Then came the final insult. Emily approached Robert with documents in hand, her tone clinical, almost compassionate. She told him it was time to consider alternative living arrangements. For his safety, she said. For everyone's peace of mind, she implied doctors had concerns. That, Daniel agreed. That the house was no longer the right environment for him. Robert stared at her, disbelief giving way to cold fury. "This is my home," he said. "You don't get to decide when I leave it." Emily's expression hardened. She reminded him of his health, of the legal realities, of how things could be handled gently or not. It was the first time she didn't bother hiding the threat beneath her words. Robert straightened, every ounce of strength he had left gathering behind his gaze. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "And if you try to force me, I will expose everything." The room fell silent. Emily turned away, jaw tight, already recalculating. Daniel stood frozen, torn and uncertain. Rebecca moved closer to her father, her presence a quiet declaration of loyalty. As Robert looked around the house he had built, he understood how close he was to losing it all. The next move, hers or his, would decide whether he remained the patriarch of his legacy or became a footnote erased by deceit. And somewhere beyond the walls of the mansion, truths were about to surface that no one could control. The process began quietly, the way all dangerous things do. Robert was informed, politely, formally, that questions had been raised regarding his capacity to manage his affairs. There would be evaluations, consultations, reviews. Nothing accusatory, the letters assured him, merely procedural. Emily moved behind the scenes with practiced efficiency, speaking to attorneys and advisors, framing the situation as concern rather than conflict. Each step she took tightened the legal net she intended to cast around him. Robert understood exactly what she was doing. He didn't protest publicly. He didn't argue with the doctors or confront the attorneys. Instead, he prepared. With Martin's help, he revised his will in absolute secrecy, adding safeguards that could not be challenged easily. If anything happened to him, illness, incapacity, or worse, control of the estate would pass to Rebecca and the rightful heirs, bypassing Emily entirely. It was a calculated move, one that would infuriate her if discovered. Daniel felt the strain immediately. He moved through the house like a man pulled in opposite directions, avoiding both confrontation and clarity. He still loved his father, but every conversation with Emily chipped away at that loyalty. She spoke of irresponsibility, of rash decisions, of changes that made no sense. When she learned Robert had altered the will, she seized on it as proof. "See," she told Daniel, "he's acting out of fear. He's not thinking clearly." The words stuck. Daniel began pulling away again, interpreting Robert's resolve as instability rather than self-defense. Each attempt Robert made to reach him felt more strained than the last. The distance widened until even shared space felt hostile. Rebecca refused to stand still. She dug deeper into Emily's financial trail, expanding beyond what they had already uncovered. What she found unsettled her. Emily's schemes extended further than the estate investments siphoned through layered entities. Funds moved offshore, patterns designed to avoid detection. This wasn't opportunism. It was long-term planning. Emily hadn't just married into the family. She had targeted it. The realization hardened Rebecca's resolve. She documented everything, copying files, building timelines, preparing for the moment when truth would matter more than denial. Robert, meanwhile, felt the weight of isolation pressed down on him. The house was no longer a refuge. Every conversation felt monitored, every silence suspicious. Even Daniel's presence brought more pain than comfort now. With options narrowing, Robert made a choice he had delayed for too long. He asked Emily to meet him privately. They sat across from each other in the study, the air thick with unspoken history. Robert didn't accuse. He didn't raise his voice. He told her he knew what she was doing, that he understood the investigation, the manipulation, the pressure she was applying to Daniel. He told her it would stop. Emily listened. Expression unreadable. Then she smiled, small, tight, controlled. She reminded him of the evaluations, of the advisors already questioning his decisions. She suggested he consider how things would look if this became public. The smile faded, replaced by something colder. She warned him, subtly, that she would not lose. Robert met her gaze without flinching. "Neither will I," he said. For the first time, Emily hesitated. She left the room knowing the ground beneath her was no longer stable. Robert was no longer reacting. He was moving. And if quiet manipulation had failed, she would need something stronger, something decisive to secure her position. As the door closed behind her, Robert remained seated, his heart pounding, his future uncertain. The game had turned openly dangerous now, and both of them knew it. Only one of them would control what came next. Rebecca found the clause at 3 a.m. She had been reading the same documents for hours, eyes burning, fingers stiff from scrolling and highlighting, when something finally felt wrong, not missing, but misplaced. A reference number that didn't align. A cross-citation buried in an appendix that redirected authority in a way no one had questioned because it was written to look routine. When she followed it carefully, line by line, the truth revealed itself with brutal clarity. Emily's claim to the estate had never been legitimate. The authority she'd waved around, the confidence with which she'd spoken of control, it was built on selective disclosure. The clause granting her power depended on conditions that were never legally met, contingencies quietly overridden by later amendments Emily had intentionally concealed. It wasn't clever lawyering, it was deception. Rebecca printed everything. By morning, Robert sat across from her at the kitchen table, reading in silence as the weight of it settled in. His hands trembled not from weakness, but from restrained fury. Emily hadn't just manipulated the family. She had constructed an illusion of inevitability, betting that no one would ever look closely enough to challenge it. This time, Robert didn't hesitate. He called Daniel into the study and summoned Emily moments later. When they arrived, the documents were already laid out, neatly organized, undeniable. Robert spoke first, his voice steady, controlled, as he walked them through the clauses, the contradictions, the omissions. Rebecca filled in the gaps, explaining how Emily's supposed authority collapsed under scrutiny. Daniel listened in stunned silence. As the truth unfolded, the color drained from his face. He tried to interrupt once, then stopped himself, flipping through pages with shaking hands. Every excuse he had clung to misunderstanding, concern, protection fell apart under the weight of evidence. For the first time, he looked at Emily not as his wife, but as a stranger who had been shaping his reality without consent. Emily reacted exactly as Robert expected. She laughed at first, dismissive, accusing Rebecca of twisting language, of manufacturing chaos. Then her tone sharpened. She turned on Rebecca directly, calling her bitter, resentful, desperate to reclaim relevance in a family she had abandoned. She accused her of trying to destroy what little unity remained. Rebecca didn't flinch. She stood her ground, meeting Emily's accusations with quiet certainty. "You did this," she said simply. "Not me." Robert watched the exchange with grim resolve. This was no longer about winning an argument. It was about ending a lie that had poisoned his family from the inside out. That afternoon, Robert authorized the next phase. The legal battle began in earnest motions filed, claims challenged, authority contested. There would be no quiet resolution now. Emily's actions would be examined under scrutiny she could no longer control. Robert understood the cost. Courtrooms, headlines, reputations, dragged through procedural mud. But the alternative, allowing deception to define his legacy, was unacceptable. As if on cue, Detective Sarah Hayes returned. This time, her presence was anything but routine. She met Robert with files thicker than he expected, her tone grave. The investigation into Emily's finances had expanded rapidly once her name surfaced in connection with irregular transfers. What they'd uncovered went far beyond the estate. Emily had been siphoning money for years. Not just small amounts, not just internal manipulation, large sums diverted from family investment accounts, laundered through layered entities, funneled into ventures with no legitimate paper trail. Hayes explained that some of the funds were now linked to ongoing criminal investigations. Robert listened, stunned, as the scope of Emily's betrayal widened into something darker and far more dangerous. The room fell silent when Hayes finished. Robert leaned back slowly, the weight of generations pressing down on him. This was no longer about protecting a house or reclaiming authority. It was about salvaging a name that had stood for integrity, work, and trust. Emily hadn't just targeted him. She had targeted everything he intended to pass on. As Hayes gathered her files and Daniel sat motionless, caught between shock and shame, Robert felt a cold resolve settle in. The fight ahead would be brutal, public, unforgiving, but for the first time since this began, the truth was no longer hidden. And now that it was out in the open, there would be no escape from what came next. Emily waited until the house was quiet before she spoke to Daniel. She found him alone in their bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, shoulders slumped, staring at nothing. Her voice softened as she approached, careful not to startle him. She told him they were being cornered, that Robert was determined to take everything back, that the legal moves already underway would destroy them both if he didn't act. She framed it as survival, as loyalty, as the final stand of a marriage under siege. "Stand with me," she said. "If you don't, we lose everything." Daniel didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw. He admitted what he'd been avoiding for weeks, that he felt guilty. Guilty for not listening to his father. Guilty for allowing decisions to be made in his name without question. He told Emily he felt like he had betrayed the man who built his life. But even as he said it, uncertainty crept in. He didn't know how to undo what had already been done. He didn't know how to choose without destroying someone he loved. Emily seized on the hesitation. She shifted tactics, letting tears fall, telling Daniel that Robert's actions proved he was afraid, unstable, clinging to control because he couldn't accept change. She warned that if Robert won, Daniel would be sidelined completely, another casualty of his father's stubborn pride. She didn't ask Daniel to defend her anymore. She asked him to protect himself. Across the house, Robert sat with Rebecca in the dimly lit kitchen, the weight of the past weeks hanging heavy between them. They spoke quietly, acknowledging the damage relationships strained, trust broken, years of silence catching up with them all at once. Robert admitted his regret for pushing Rebecca away years earlier. Rebecca admitted she had stayed away too long. What mattered now was what remained. "We'll protect it," Rebecca said, her hand steady over his. "Whatever it takes." The legal battle intensified quickly. Robert reached out to old allies who remembered the man he'd been before illness and betrayal. Documents were reviewed, affidavits prepared, records verified. Each step forward felt like reclaiming a piece of himself, even as the cost became clearer. This wouldn't end quietly. The estate was becoming a battleground, and Emily was no longer pretending otherwise. Daniel felt the shift inside himself. Every conversation replayed in his mind with new clarity. Things Emily had said, moments she had redirected or silenced him, decisions made without his understanding. Regret settled in, heavy and unavoidable. He began to wonder if the woman he trusted most had been shaping his fears as much as his future. The confrontation came unexpectedly. Robert and Emily found themselves face to face in the study, the air thick with tension. Emily opened with accusation, calling Robert cruel, vindictive, unwilling to let go. She painted herself as the target of his obsession, the victim of his refusal to accept reality. Robert listened without interrupting. When she finished, he spoke calmly, his voice steady despite the toll the fight had taken on him. He told her he would not step aside, not for convenience, not for manipulation, not for someone who had built her power on lies. He told her the truth was already moving beyond her reach, into courts, into investigations she couldn't charm her way out of. "I will protect what I built," Robert said, "and I will expose everything you've done." Emily's composure cracked. For the first time, fear showed through the anger. She lashed out, accusing him of tearing his family apart, of destroying his own son. Robert didn't respond. He didn't need to. His resolve was clear. As Emily stormed out, the house seemed to hold its breath. Daniel stood nearby, having heard more than either of them realized. He remained silent, the conflict written across his face. The breaking point had arrived, not in a courtroom, not in public, but within him. And as he watched his father stand unyielding in the aftermath, Daniel understood something that could no longer be ignored. One choice remained, and whatever he chose next would define the rest of their lives. Emily knew she was losing. The house no longer bent around her the way it once had. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Calls went unanswered. Even Daniel, who had been her anchor for so long, had grown distant, guarded. Desperation sharpened her instincts, and with it came one last gamble. She confronted Daniel late at night, her voice stripped of softness. This time, she didn't pretend it was about concern or love. She told him plainly that he had to choose, her or his family, loyalty or abandonment. She warned him that siding with Robert would mean public disgrace, legal fallout, a future spent cleaning up a mess that wasn't his making. "If you walk away from me now," she said, "you lose everything." Daniel listened without interrupting. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady in a way it hadn't been for months. He told her he was already lost and that it had happened the moment he realized how much of his life had been shaped by her lies. He admitted that while she believed she was in control, he had been quietly gathering evidence, emails, recordings, documents she never imagined he would question. He had needed to know the truth for himself before choosing a side. "I'm done," Daniel said. "I'm not doing this anymore." The words landed with finality. Emily stared at him, stunned, as if the ground beneath her had shifted too suddenly to comprehend. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply walked away, leaving behind the version of himself she had carefully constructed. When Daniel told Robert the truth, the effect was immediate. The weight Robert had been carrying for months seemed to lift, replaced by a grim clarity. Empowered by his son's decision, he moved decisively, combining Daniel's evidence with what Rebecca and Martin had already assembled. The legal filings that followed were precise and unforgiving, designed not just to challenge Emily's claims, but to dismantle them entirely. Each motion pushed her further into a corner with fewer exits. Rebecca didn't wait for the courts to speak. She confronted Emily directly in the living room, the tension sharp enough to slice through the silence. Rebecca accused her of manipulating Daniel, of isolating him, of rewriting reality to suit her ambitions. She laid out the damaged years of deceit, fractured relationships, calculated cruelty. Emily listened with her chin raised, refusing to apologize, refusing to concede even now. "You did this to yourself," Rebecca said. "All of it." Emily laughed, hollow and brittle. Denial was all she had left. The family fractured openly after that. Daniel cut contact with Emily entirely. Conversations between rooms turned into arguments. Staff avoided eye contact. The house echoed with raised voices and slammed doors as Emily's lies surfaced one by one. No charm could smooth this over. No performance could erase the evidence piling up against her. Then Detective Sarah Hayes made her move. She returned with warrants and findings that confirmed what Robert had feared. The financial crimes were extensive fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement spanning years. Accounts traced, shell companies exposed. Hayes spoke plainly when she explained the charges that were now being prepared. This wasn't a civil dispute anymore. It was criminal. Emily heard the words as if through water. The reality settled in slowly. Then all at once, the estate was gone. Daniel was gone. The future she had engineered so meticulously had collapsed under the weight of truth. Every attempt to control the outcome had accelerated her downfall instead. Robert watched from a distance as the consequences closed in. There was no satisfaction in it, only a sobering awareness of how close everything had come to ruin. His legacy had survived, but barely. And as Emily stood isolated, surrounded by the wreckage of her own making, Robert understood that this was only the beginning of the end, because the descent had started, and there would be no way back up from here. Detective Sarah Hayes didn't raise her voice when she spoke to Emily. She didn't need to. They sat across from each other in a small, neutral room, the air stripped of warmth or comfort. Hayes slid a folder across the table and opened it slowly, methodically, as if laying out something inevitable. Inside were bank records, transaction logs, shell company registries, and signed statements. Each page told the same story from a different angle: fraud, conspiracy, manipulation, layered carefully over years. Hayes explained what came next: warrants prepared, accounts frozen, arrests imminent. Emily listened, expression tight, eyes scanning the pages as if searching for an exit that no longer existed. When Hayes finished, she closed the folder and stood, leaving Emily alone with the weight of what she had built and what was about to collapse. Word traveled quickly through the house. Robert felt the relief first, a subtle loosening in his chest. He hadn't realized he'd been holding back. But it didn't bring comfort. Not yet. He remained cautious, aware that desperation could drive Emily to one final, reckless move. He kept his routines unchanged, his guard up, refusing to assume the danger had passed simply because the law was catching up. Daniel moved through the days like someone learning how to stand again. The marriage he had defended at the cost of his family was over, replaced by a hollow clarity that left little room for denial. He sought his father out more often now. Conversations awkward but sincere. Apologies came slowly, uneven, and imperfect, but they came. Robert listened without interrupting, recognizing the effort for what it was, a beginning, not an absolution. Rebecca became the steady presence they all needed. She worked closely with Robert and Martin, reviewing succession plans, restructuring oversight, making sure every safeguard was in place. There was no appetite for secrecy anymore. Transparency became the rule, fairness the standard. Rebecca didn't seek control for herself. She sought balance, determined that no one would ever again exploit the family's trust so completely. Gradually, the house changed. Meals were quieter, but no longer tense. Laughter returned in brief, cautious moments. Robert allowed himself to feel it, the love he had kept at a distance. The trust he had feared would make him vulnerable. His children were flawed, hurt, and learning, but they were here. That mattered more than pride. Emily, meanwhile, unraveled. The reality of her situation settled in. As legal notices arrived and accounts went dark, advisors stopped returning her calls. Friends disappeared. The power she had wielded so confidently evaporated, leaving panic in its place. She paced, rehearsed explanations that no longer convinced even her. The walls closed in with each passing hour. Robert reclaimed his place deliberately. He resumed control of the estate, not as an act of dominance, but of restoration. Meetings were held, decisions made, futures secured. For the first time in months, he felt aligned with his own life again. The illness still lingered. The scars remained, but the control was his earned, defended, and now restored. As evening fell one night, Robert stood in the study, watching the light stretch across the grounds. This chapter was ending, not neatly, not without cost, but it was ending. Somewhere beyond the gates, the law was preparing to close in on Emily. And though Robert knew justice rarely arrived cleanly, he also knew this much was true. Her fall was no longer a question of if, only when. The courtroom was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, as if even the walls were listening. Robert sat upright beside Rebecca, his hands folded, his face drawn but composed. Across the room, Emily avoided his gaze, her confidence long since stripped away by weeks of testimony. The proceedings moved carefully now, methodically dismantling what she had built. Documents were projected, emails read aloud, financial trails traced with precision that left little room for interpretation. What emerged was devastating. Emily's attempts to manipulate Daniel were no longer speculation, they were documented. Messages revealed how she had guided his doubts, reframed his father's actions, and isolated him when loyalty wavered. Witnesses testified about meetings Emily had orchestrated behind closed doors, the way she positioned herself as the sole voice of reason while quietly undermining Robert's authority. The mask she had worn for years fell away piece by piece. Daniel watched it all unfold, his face pale, his jaw clenched. Each revelation felt like a personal indictment. He heard his own words repeated back to him, phrases he had once believed were his own thoughts. Now, he recognized them for what they were: echoes of manipulation. By the time the final evidence was presented, the truth was undeniable. He had been used, and worse, he had helped cause the damage. When the session adjourned, Daniel didn't hesitate. He approached Robert in the hallway, his voice breaking as he apologized not defensively, not conditionally, but fully. He admitted his failure to protect the family, his willingness to doubt the man who had never doubted him. He promised to make amends, knowing forgiveness wasn't guaranteed. Robert listened in silence. The anger that once burned so sharply had faded into exhaustion. He saw not the son who had turned away, but the man standing before him now ashamed, humbled, trying to rebuild. Robert nodded once. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was permission to try. That alone felt like progress. The days that followed were heavy but steady. With the estate secured and Emily's control dismantled, Robert finally allowed himself to breathe. The fight had taken more from him than he cared to admit physically, emotionally. Yet beneath the fatigue was relief. The future, once threatened, felt solid again. Rebecca stood at the center of it all. She worked alongside attorneys and advisors, her role no longer questioned or minimized. Robert watched her with quiet pride. Recognizing strength he had once overlooked, their conversations grew warmer, more honest. The distance between them closed not through grand gestures, but through mutual respect finally earned. Emily's trouble multiplied. As the trial continued, more names surfaced: former associates, accountants, business partners, each stepping forward with their own pieces of the story. The scope of her crimes expanded beyond the family estate, exposing a network of deception that reached far wider than Robert had ever imagined. The consequences were no longer abstract. They were inevitable. At home, the family began to rebuild. It wasn't immediate. Trust returned slowly, cautiously. Meals were shared again, plans discussed. Robert found himself involving his children in decisions, not out of necessity, but choice. For the first time in years, he felt supported rather than surrounded. Daniel started over quietly. He moved out, not in shame, but in recognition that distance was necessary. He took a job on his own terms, rebuilding without the safety net he once relied on. The work was humbling, grounding. It reminded him of who he was before ambition and fear had clouded his judgment. Robert noticed the change. As the weeks passed, his thoughts turned toward the future, not as something to defend, but something to shape. There were plans to revise, structures to simplify, conversations still to be had. Healing, he knew, wasn't an endpoint. It was a process. And though the courtroom battles were nearing their end, Robert understood that consequences had a longer reach. The truth was out now, undeniable and permanent. As he stood one evening at the edge of the property, watching the last light fade, Robert felt something unfamiliar but welcome. Hope tempered, realistic, earned. Yet even as the family found its footing again, one question lingered quietly in his mind. What would happen when the final verdict was spoken aloud and the past was no longer something they could outrun? The courtroom was silent as the sentence was read. Emily stood motionless, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the last traces of defiance drained from her face. The charges were recited one by one: financial fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement, each carrying weight that could no longer be argued away. When the judge finally spoke the words that mattered most, the finality settled like a closing door. Prison time. No ambiguity. No delay. It was over. Robert listened without triumph. There was no sense of victory, only a profound stillness. He had imagined this moment in fragments: anger, satisfaction, relief. But none of those fit. What he felt instead was exhaustion, layered with a quiet grief for the family that might have existed if betrayal hadn't taken root. Outside the courtroom, cameras waited. Questions hovered. Robert said nothing. He didn't owe the world an explanation for surviving. In the days that followed, the house felt different again. Not tense, not guarded, simply quiet. Robert spent long mornings alone, walking the grounds, replaying the past years with an honesty he had avoided before. He acknowledged his own distance, the walls he'd built in the name of control. Emily's betrayal had been calculated and cruel, but it had also exposed fractures he could no longer ignore. Moving forward meant more than restoring power. It meant changing. Daniel approached that change cautiously. Without Emily's shadow, he seemed smaller at first, unsure of where to stand. But he kept showing up. He asked questions instead of making assumptions. He listened. Conversations with his father were still careful, but they no longer felt forced. Slowly, trust began to reform, not as it had been, but as something more deliberate. Rebecca remained steady throughout it all. She worked alongside Robert to finalize the restructuring of the estate, ensuring transparency and shared oversight. Every decision was documented, every safeguard reinforced. Robert no longer saw this as relinquishing control. He saw it as protecting the future from the kind of secrecy that had nearly destroyed them. Family dinners returned, awkward at first, then warmer. Robert felt the weight of love again, not the conditional kind built on expectation, but the quiet presence of people choosing to stay. He allowed himself to accept it, even when it felt unfamiliar. Healing didn't erase the past, but it softened its edges. Emily's downfall became official when the estate was formally released from any remaining claims tied to her name. Her influence, once so pervasive, vanished completely. The legacy she had tried to steal was now beyond her reach, secured by the very people she had underestimated. One evening, Robert gathered Daniel and Rebecca in the study. He spoke plainly, without ceremony. The estate would remain intact. No fragmentation, no shortcuts. The legacy he had built would stay within the family, protected by clear structure and mutual accountability. He explained the roles each of them would play not as rewards, but as responsibilities. They listened. As Robert finished, a sense of finality settled in, not an ending, but a closure long overdue. The road behind them had been brutal, marked by betrayal and loss, but the road ahead, while uncertain, belonged to them again. Later that night, Robert stood at the window, watching the lights fade across the property. The house was still standing, so was his family. And as he turned away, he knew the truth of it. This wasn't just the end of Emily's road. It was the beginning of theirs. Harmful now. Daniel worked just as hard in his own way. He showed up early. He followed through. When mistakes happened, he owned them without deflection. He didn't ask to be trusted again. He behaved as if trust was something to be earned daily. He took responsibility not just in words, but in consistency, understanding that regret meant nothing without change to back it up. Rebecca became the bridge between them. She refused to let conversations collapse into old patterns. When voices tightened, she slowed them down. When assumptions surfaced, she challenged them gently, but firmly. She reminded Robert and Daniel that neither could rewrite the past, but both could decide how much power it held over the future. Her role wasn't neutral, it was intentional, grounded in the belief that this family was worth the effort. Robert began to notice the shift in himself first. He laughed once during dinner, an unguarded sound that surprised them all. He caught himself enjoying the quiet presence of his children, the way the house felt lived in rather than contested. These moments didn't erase the damage, but they softened its edges. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't bracing for betrayal. Emily's arrest still hovered over everything. Her name surfaced in news articles, in whispers among acquaintances, in letters that arrived from attorneys long after the case had settled. The fallout was real, and its shadows reached farther than Robert wished they would. But gradually, the family stopped reacting to it. They learned to let the past exist without dominating every conversation. One afternoon, Robert found Daniel working in the study, reviewing documents with quiet focus. He paused in the doorway, watching his son handle responsibility without prompting. There was no grand realization, no sudden forgiveness, just a calm understanding that something had changed. That night, Robert told Daniel about therapy. He didn't frame it as progress or confession. He simply shared it as truth. Daniel listened, visibly moved, and for the first time, didn't rush to respond. The silence between them felt different, no longer fragile, but reflective. Healing continued in fragments. Shared walks on the property, honest disagreements that didn't escalate, plans discussed without suspicion. Robert allowed himself to appreciate these smaller moments, understanding that trust wasn't rebuilt through dramatic gestures, but through repetition and patience. Rebecca watched it all with cautious optimism. She knew the road ahead would be long, that setbacks were inevitable, that forgiveness didn't move in straight lines. But she also saw resilience where there had once been only fracture. As winter edged toward spring, the family began speaking about the future, not defensively, not strategically, but openly. There were no guarantees offered, no promises made lightly, only an agreement to keep showing up, even when it was uncomfortable. Late one evening, Robert stood alone in the living room, lights dimmed, listening to the low murmur of Daniel and Rebecca talking nearby. The house felt different now, not healed but healing. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart, Robert believed that might be enough to begin again. The moment arrived without ceremony. Robert and Daniel were sitting across from each other in the study, papers spread between them more out of habit than necessity. The conversation had drifted, as it often did lately, careful and measured. Then Daniel hesitated, took a breath, and said something that stopped Robert cold. "I want to start something of my own," Daniel said. "And I'm not asking you to fund it." The words landed differently than any apology ever had. Daniel explained slowly, choosing each sentence with intention. He had an idea, modest, grounded, built on skills he'd ignored for too long. He talked about risk, about learning curves, about failure being a real possibility. He didn't ask for a safety net. He asked for perspective. Robert studied his son's face, searching for the old entitlement, the expectation that had once poisoned everything. He didn't find it. What he saw instead was resolve, uncertain but real. For the first time in years, Daniel wasn't looking for rescue. He was looking for responsibility. Robert nodded. He offered advice, not money. He talked about mistakes he'd made early on, about deals that looked promising and weren't, about the discipline required to survive when enthusiasm faded. He warned Daniel where to be cautious and where to be bold. It wasn't mentorship delivered from a pedestal. It was experience shared honestly. Rebecca noticed the change immediately. She watched them from the doorway later. The way their conversation flowed without tension, without defensiveness. There was something lighter in Robert's posture, something steadier in Daniel's tone. It wasn't reconciliation in a dramatic sense. It was alignment. And for Rebecca, it felt like the first genuine sign that the damage done might finally be healing at its core. Robert felt it too. The resentment he'd carried quiet, corrosive, began to loosen its grip. He acknowledged, finally, that he hadn't been blameless. His distance had created space for manipulation. His silence had taught his son to seek approval elsewhere. Letting go of that resentment didn't mean excusing betrayal. It meant refusing to live inside it any longer. The family dynamic shifted in subtle but undeniable ways. Decisions became collaborative rather than cautious. Plans were discussed openly, without hidden agendas. The house, once divided by suspicion, now echoed with purposeful activity. They were rebuilding not just finances, but trust brick by brick, conversation by conversation. Megan noticed it first from the outside. She joined Robert one afternoon in the kitchen, her tone gentle, unassuming. She told him she could see the effort he was making and the effect it was having. She reminded him kindly that healing didn't happen in straight lines, that even good days would be followed by hard ones. That trust required maintenance, not declarations. Robert appreciated her honesty. It struck him how different this felt from the past. No pressure, no performance, just patience. He realized that vulnerability, something he had once viewed as weakness, was now the very thing holding his family together. Daniel stepped into his new role deliberately. He worked long hours, asked questions, accepted criticism without defensiveness. When setbacks came, he didn't hide them. He addressed them. Each small success felt earned, not inherited. Robert watched with quiet pride, resisting the urge to intervene unless asked. The Matthews family, once fractured by betrayal, began to function again. Not perfectly, not without history, but with intention. They spoke about the future with cautious optimism, aware of how quickly things could unravel if taken for granted. Trust, they understood now, was a living thing. One evening, as the family gathered around the table, laughter breaking through a moment of shared memory, Robert felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Hope, not naive, not blind, earned through effort and honesty. As he looked at his children flawed, resilient, choosing each other again, Robert knew this was the turning point. What came next wouldn't be defined by the past alone, but by what they continued to build together. And the responsibility for protecting that future rested with all of them. The moment came quietly, the way the most important ones often do. Robert and Daniel stood side by side on the back patio, the late afternoon light stretching long shadows across the yard. Neither spoke for a while. The silence wasn't strained anymore. It felt earned. Then Daniel cleared his throat, his voice low but steady. "Thank you," he said, "for believing in me again, even when I didn't deserve it." Robert turned to him, studying his son's face. He saw humility there now instead of defensiveness, effort instead of expectation. The anger he once carried didn't rise. It simply wasn't needed anymore. "We both stumbled," Robert replied. "What matters is that we didn't stay down." Daniel nodded, emotion tightening his jaw. In that brief exchange, something shifted permanently, not back to what they'd been, but forward into something more honest. As the days passed, Robert found himself reflecting more than resisting. The betrayal, the courtrooms, the sleepless nights they had carved deep scars. But they had also stripped away illusions he'd lived with for too long. Control hadn't protected his family. Distance hadn't preserved respect. What had survived was truth, spoken painfully but finally aloud. That understanding followed him into the holiday gathering. For the first time in years, the dining table was full without tension humming beneath the surface. Food was passed, Stories were shared. Laughter surfaced naturally, tentative at first, then easier. There was no need to avoid certain topics, no fear of what might erupt. The shadow that once loomed over every gathering had lifted. Robert watched it all quietly, absorbing the sound of his family simply being together. Rebecca joined him near the kitchen doorway later, handing him a drink. Their conversation was unhurried, comfortable in a way it hadn't been since she was younger. They spoke about the past, honestly, not to reopen wounds, but to acknowledge what they had survived. Robert apologized without deflection for the distance he'd created. Rebecca accepted it without bitterness. They weren't rebuilding what had been lost. They were building something new. Daniel, meanwhile, moved through the evening with calm confidence. He spoke about his plans without seeking approval, shared setbacks without shame. The man he was becoming no longer lived in his father's shadow, but beside it, aware of its weight, yet no longer defined by it. Robert recognized the difference immediately. Later that night, as the table cleared and the house settled into warmth and quiet, Robert felt a decision crystallize. He would let go of the past, not erase it, not excuse it, but release its grip. Love, he understood now, required boundaries as much as forgiveness. Trust wasn't blind, it was intentional, and protecting the family meant honoring both. The Matthews family wasn't whole in a perfect sense. They were scarred, changed, wiser, but they were together. As Robert stood at the window, watching the lights glow softly against the dark, he felt something steadier than relief take root. This wasn't an ending meant to wrap everything neatly. It was a beginning shaped by hard lessons and deliberate choices. Whatever challenges waited ahead, and Robert knew there would be some, they would be faced without lies, without silence, without pretending nothing could break them again. Because now, they knew better. And that knowledge, hard-earned and deeply felt, would shape everything that came next. The path behind the house curved gently through the trees, worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Robert and Daniel walked side by side, their pace unhurried. The quiet between them filled not with tension, but reflection. Winter had softened into early spring, and the air carried the scent of damp earth and renewal. It felt like the right place for a conversation that had taken years to reach. They spoke about the past without circling it. Robert admitted how fear had shaped his choices, how holding too tightly to control had blinded him to what his family needed most. Daniel spoke of insecurity, of how easily he had confused approval with love, and how that confusion had made him vulnerable to manipulation. There was no blame left in their voices, only recognition. At one point, Robert stopped walking. He looked at his son, really looked at him, and said the words he had been carrying quietly for months. "Forgiveness isn't easy," he said, "but it's the only way to heal. Not forgetting, not pretending, choosing to move forward anyway." Daniel nodded, emotion tightening his throat. He understood now that forgiveness wasn't something given freely or lightly. It was earned through accountability and sustained by effort. And in that moment, he felt the weight of what his father was offering. Back at the house, the family gathered naturally, drawn together by habit rather than obligation. Conversation drifted from practical matters to memories that no longer carried sharp edges. Laughter came easily. The sense of peace wasn't perfect or permanent, but it was real. Daniel felt it most as he prepared to leave later that evening. He stood by his car, keys in hand, ready to return to the life he was building, one defined by his own work, his own choices. He wasn't running from his family anymore, nor hiding behind it. He was stepping forward, grounded and determined, ready to make his mark, without shortcuts. Robert watched from the porch, a quiet pride settling in his chest. For the first time, he felt true closure, not because the past had been resolved neatly, but because it no longer dictated the future. The values he had tried to teach through discipline and expectation had finally taken root through experience. Integrity, responsibility, resilience. Daniel hadn't inherited them. He had earned them. Inside, Rebecca and Megan moved through the kitchen, talking softly, planning something ordinary. The simplicity of it struck Robert deeply. These moments, the mundane, the unguarded, were what he had almost lost. And now, they were his again. As night fell, Robert joined Daniel on the path one last time, the two of them walking a few steps farther together before parting ways. There were no speeches left to make, no lessons left to deliver, just presence. The family had come through betrayal, loss, and hard truth. They carried scars that would never fully fade, but they also carried something stronger now, a shared understanding of what mattered and what didn't. And as Robert and Daniel walked into the future, they realized that they had truly broken free from the manipulation that once controlled their lives, and their legacy would be built on truth, unity, and love.